All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Tess Wilson, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the National Network of Libraries of Medicine, Middle Atlantic Region, and I'm a member of the Library Freedom Project. Thank you for joining me today for Online Privacy 101. A few matters of housekeeping before we start. Closed captioning is available. The link is going to be provided in the chat box for you. This session is being recorded and it'll be available on the NNLM YouTube channel in a few weeks. So feel free to check that out and share it among your networks. You can chat your questions to all participants throughout the session. Participants in this class are eligible for a CE. And your feedback matters, so please complete the evaluation at the end of the webinar to receive your code to receive that CE and to help us improve future trainings. So our agenda and objectives for today, I'm going to provide you with some background information about the Library Freedom Project and the Library Freedom Institute, which is how I got involved with privacy advocacy. Some basic information about online privacy issues to provide a foundation for today's conversation, and some practical tools we can use to be more confidently safe and conscientious online. So we'll reflect on the concepts of privacy and security as they relate to our own lives. We'll recognize privacy and security vulnerabilities in common app and software features. And we'll explore techniques for making more secure passwords, for fortifying our browsers and search engines, and more. Before we truly begin, I just wanted to do a little icebreaker that can be an interesting way to kick off a conversation about online privacy. So feel free to write your answers in the chat to these two questions. What questions, concerns, or statements have you heard regarding online privacy? And, or what questions, concerns, or statements have you had or made about online privacy? And I'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute. Can I truly protect my privacy? Is online privacy even possible anymore? If someone wants to find it, they'll find it. These are all great. We're following the law. That's really interesting. From a university IT, that's interesting. There is no online privacy. VPNs, okay. Oh, so patrons don't care about privacy or don't understand how having a good password protects them. We're going to talk a lot about passwords later. Okay, feel free to keep adding. Now, some of the most popular ones I hear as a librarian, and I come from a public library background, and I also spent some time in a public library's workforce development office. So these were some of the questions or concerns that I ran into a lot. It's just the internet. I don't care that people know what I eat and what I do. If they want to know, more power to them. I'm just one in millions. How can anyone see me? I get a discount on insert service, insurance, whatever the case may be. I'm getting the service for free is a statement that we often get. This isn't an issue for me, and the classic statement, which I've seen pop up a few times already, I've got nothing to hide. So I wanted to give you a short background about the origins of the Library Freedom Project. This is a group that teaches librarians about surveillance issues, privacy rights, and digital tools to support the fight against these issues. So the project began in 2015 when the Kilton Public Library was the first public library to run Tor, which is an anonymity service that we'll talk about later on its extra bandwidth. Shortly after this service began, it was halted because the library got a heads up from the Department of Homeland Security notifying them about the possible criminal uses of Tor. Eventually, with some support from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, the Tor Project, and members of the public, the service was renewed. But this threat left a lasting sense of doom and doubt for those who champion privacy in public libraries. So in 2016, New Hampshire, where the Kilton Public Library is located, introduced a bill allowing public libraries to run privacy software like Tor, and that bill passed. Since then, the Library Freedom Project has been working hard to fight against these kinds of threats to privacy, and they do so by creating a growing network of information professionals through the Library Freedom Institute. So the first Library Freedom Institute cohort was 2018 to 2019. 13 librarians from around the country trained and worked together to address privacy in their own communities and to become better privacy advocates. So this was a great way to meet other information professionals who were also passionate about privacy issues. I was part of the first cohort. It's hard to become a privacy expert because our digital world is constantly changing and there are new considerations all the time. So I am no expert, but I have learned a lot from my colleagues, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. As I mentioned, I work for the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. So in my position, I manage funding for libraries and community organizations to bring health literacy program into their space. This can take a lot of different forms, from a fitness workshop to a community health fair to health screenings. I also train library staff, community organizations, and anyone else who's interested on how to navigate National Library of Medicine resources, and I offer ideas about how to incorporate health information into library practices. So why is a health sciences librarian talking to you about online privacy? As I said, we live in a digital world. Practices and processes regarding privacy change daily, and they get more difficult to navigate. I consider digital health to be something that affects us all, especially vulnerable populations, our seniors, young children, our immigrant and refugee neighbors, and many other subsets of our global community. Think about the last thing you did online. Were you using a secure connection? Do you know if you're using a secure connection? What browser or search engine did you use? Did you input any personal information in that interaction? What information could someone have found from that interaction? So just as increasing our health literacy allows us to access information that might help us manage symptoms, treat diseases, or establish good habits, increasing our digital literacy allows us to take control of our digital footprint. When I say digital footprint, I'm referring to something that has many names. Some might refer to it as a digital shadow, digital or data traces, but we're all essentially talking about the same thing. This definition from the Tactical Tech Collective, they're the creators of the Me and My Shadow project, explains this concept well. Through your computer, mobile phone, and other digital devices, you leave behind hundreds of digital traces every day. Bits of information about you that are created, stored, and collected. When your digital traces are put together to create stories about you or profiles of you, these become your digital shadows. They can give others huge insight into your life, and they can also be totally wrong. Either way, once they're out there, they are almost impossible to control. So they suggest these first steps in assessing your digital footprint. 1, log out of your email and social media accounts, clear your browser history and cookies, and use a privacy-protecting search engine like DuckDuckGo. 2, create a list of all your usernames. Do a search for your name and all your different usernames in a search engine. Again, preferably a privacy-protecting search engine. Someone's already saying DuckDuckGo. Good, good. Go to different social media platforms and search for your name and usernames. Now, take a second to find out what these platforms reveal about you. What kind of data has been collected about you? According to Bruce Schneier, who's the author of the book Data and Goliath, there are 6 different types of digital traces based on the different ways that they're created. So I'm going to go over those really quickly right now, because it helps to establish when we're talking about data, especially big data, it helps to have a glossary and a foundation of definitions that we're all using together. So service data is information you provide in order to receive a service. So this data could include your legal name, your age, the country you live in, could include your credit card number. For example, let's say you get a SIM card for your phone. In a lot of countries, you need to provide your mobile phone number with both your passport and bank details. Disclosed data is content like photos, messages, comments we post on blogs, websites, web pages. And here we can decide what's shared and for how long, as well as who can have access to the infrastructure and that content. Entrusted data is data that we post on a platform we don't control. So someone else can decide what happens to that data. So an example of this would be we don't control the commercial platforms like Facebook and Twitter, but millions of people post content on it. We can decide whether we'll post things on these platforms, but we can't control what the companies subsequently do with our traces. Incidental data is data about us shared by others. So in this case, think about being tagged in a picture on Facebook, or mentioned in a tweet, or even quoted in a blog or an article. We didn't create this data, and we don't control the platform it's been posted on. A note with incidental data is that it can also be shared by others without them realizing it. For example, a friend might allow WhatsApp or Google Maps access to their phone's address book, which has your name, number, and email address in it. And this is just one example of how our data traces can be really intertwined and woven together. Behavioral data is created when we interact with our computer or mobile phone. This kind of data gives insight in what we do, with whom, how often, and where. So the moment you turn on your phone, it starts creating data traces about you, where you are, who you're talking to, when and for how long, where you are and where you go, even what time you wake up and go to sleep at this point. When it comes to behavioral data, there is a case, the Carpenter case is a really interesting case to look at, and you can access that through a lot of different platforms and look it up online. The Office of Intellectual Freedom has done some really interesting, has published some interesting articles about the Carpenter case when it comes to behavioral data and phones. Derived data, finally, is a data about us that is inferred from other data. So companies create group profiles on the basis of shared characteristics that are based on social media networks, location data, browsing behavior. These individual profiles can get tied to one or more group profiles. So we essentially have no control on what group profiles we belong to, nor what inferred data traces are created. So this can be, if you've ever done the experiment on Facebook where you go into the settings, the privacy settings, and see who Facebook thinks that you are based on your activity on Facebook, that's how that's a good example of derived data. It can be really interesting to see the persona that companies have created for you. So today I hope to arm you with some information and practical tools that might help you take control over your online presence, understand the ways in which your data is being created and collected, and strive towards being a more conscientious internet user. We at the Library Freedom Project like to think that our feelings about privacy exist on a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum are the privacy vegans. These are folks who are extremely cautious. They might employ tools like Tor, use search engines like DuckDuckGo, use Firefox as their browser exclusively, and have a lot of protections in place to preserve their privacy. At the other end of the spectrum are privacy nihilists. These folks are sure that someone somewhere already has their Social Security information and bank-ready information. Privacy's dead, so precautions are a moot point. Now, most of us exist somewhere between these two extremes. We might try our best to protect ourselves, but it's also hard work to stay on top of our rapidly expanding digital footprint. And the reason many of us fall in the middle is because we have some negotiating to do with ourselves when it comes to security and privacy. We need to ask ourselves, does this tool or technology provide privacy, or does it provide security, or both? Digital privacy and security issues are constantly in the news, from the Cambridge Analytica scandal to data breaches like Experian, Google+. The terms privacy and security are often used interchangeably, but they do mean different things. So I'd like to ask you what these two words mean to you. If you could just take 1 minute to write down a short definition of privacy or security or both in the chat. And I'll give you about a minute, 30 seconds to a minute. Not public. Associating security with safety. Interesting. Privacy brings to mind HIPAA and PII, and security is how that info is protected. That's great. Confidence that your information won't be misused. I saw PII, and does anyone want to provide a definition for PII? Personally identifiable information. Okay, thank you all. These are really good definitions. So the definitions I use are: privacy is the ability to decide who gets to know what about you, and security is the steps you take to protect important things or information. So a lot of really spot-on definitions there. So this is an example that illustrates that difference from an article that I really liked in Forbes. Imagine enjoying a beautiful sunny day from your backyard. A few minutes later, imagine your neighbors decide to do the same thing next door. Instantly, the environment would change from one of relaxation to maybe one of interaction, entertainment, or maybe even uncomfortably pretending the others didn't exist. For this reason, we put up privacy fences in our yard that protects us from unwanted company or observation. So it's important to note that a privacy fence is not necessarily a form of security. It's not impenetrable and could easily be scaled by a physical intruder, but it does allow you to control who sees you and when. So privacy and security can sometimes be in tension with each other. In other words, security for some can compromise privacy for others. Here are some examples of tools and technology. And for each, I want you to consider if these are privacy features, security features, or a little of both. And feel free to write your answer down in the chat or just mull over this for yourself. Would you consider biometric authentication, so using your face or fingerprint to unlock your phone, for instance, a feature that offers privacy or security? How about the ability to be anonymous on the internet? Does this offer privacy or security? How about facial recognition enabled internet-linked cameras in high crime areas? Privacy but security as a side effect. Yep. And finally, software that notifies school officials if students use so-called trigger words in their student accounts or on school-owned devices. Interesting. Great. Thank you all for participating as well. These are important considerations when thinking about privacy and how we navigate these complex issues. Similarly, we'd like to think about if using a given tool or technology is worth the risk for the reward. So almost all of us use some kind of smartphone or social networking software to connect with people and to maybe make our lives easier. Some of the same features in apps that enhance the convenience for some people can also put other people at risk. So for example, a person being stalked or experiencing intimate partner violence or an undocumented immigrant could have a very different risk profile than a wealthy citizen in a stable relationship, for example. And that scenario of contrasting those two personas is what we refer to as threat modeling, which can be a really interesting way to think about issues of privacy and security. So here are some features of technologies and or tools that can either be more risk or more reward. So feel free to write down whether you think this is more of a risk or more of a reward in the chat as I go, or again, just mull it over. Home appliances that are remote or voice controlled and are connected to a network. A lot of risks, enthusiastic risks, okay? How about the ability to tag other people in photographs? That one I especially think is interesting if you think about it from the perspective of other people. So if someone wants to tag their family in photographs, but if you turn it around and think about the folks being tagged, it might be a different question. How about facial recognition technology that automatically scans photographs and suggests people in them? So if you use Facebook, this is a tool you might be familiar with. How about the ability to remotely turn on or off items in a home and check their usage? Maps or GPS software that store common travel patterns. Google is an example of that. Advertising customized to your interests based on search and purchase history. And the ability to remotely turn on apps that can locate a device. So these would be things like Tile or on an iPhone, the Find My Phone app. Lots of rewards for that one, okay. Great, so you can understand how hard to navigate these issues can be and how we might make some sacrifices for the sake of convenience. So let's move on to some of the practical applications, tools, and processes we can use to be safer online. When it comes to operating systems, which do you use? If you use an Apple or Microsoft operating system, as many of us probably do, it's worth considering the pros and cons of these systems. And it's also worth noting that maybe a certain operating system is just easier to use. Maybe it's more compatible with programs that you want access to. So there could be more complicated reasons to use a certain operating system over another. Windows 10, for example, is like a data sieve. This is not a great operating system when it comes to privacy for a few reasons, including the fact that your device is by default tagged with a unique advertising ID used to tailor ads to your preferences. Cortana, the Windows personal assistant technology, can collect any of your data, including calendar data, purchases, music, and more. Similarly, Windows has made it very difficult to opt out of any data collection and third-party sharing they might do. But a lot of our workplaces, maybe even at our home, a lot of these devices are running on Windows 10. So what can we do with this information? When we talk about privacy issues, it can feel like we toe the line between being scary and being helpful, but the goal of these conversations is not to scare folks into becoming either a strict privacy vegan or a strict privacy nihilist. It's to spark dialogue and to arm ourselves with knowledge and information. So in this case, we can be aware of the privacy issues inherent to whichever operating system we use. If we know more about them, we can take precautions. We can employ tools like data collection blockers, or we can use alternative systems like Debian, Fedora, or other open source operating systems. Many of these run on Linux or Linux-like platforms. So if you aren't familiar with open source software, sometimes referred to as FLOSS or FOSS, which stands for Free or Libre Open Source Software. Here's a definition I like to use that I got from a really great Wired magazine article. Open source means anyone can view the code at the heart of the system, modify it, and more importantly, share it with anyone else. This openness enables collaboration. Unlike, say, Microsoft Windows, which was developed and is maintained by a single company, Linux is developed and maintained by more than 15,000 programmers around the world. And these programmers might work for companies that compete with each other, or they might volunteer to create something new that's then given away for free. If you're able to use open source software, that's great. But even if we're stuck with, or just more comfortable with, the operating system we have, there is plenty we can do to protect ourselves online when it comes to the browsers and search engines we use. So when it comes to browsers, this is where we get into the weeds with risk versus reward. Many people use Google Chrome because it so effortlessly syncs all your information and makes sharing a lot more convenient. And it even links to outside apps. If you've ever tried a new app or logged onto a new site, you might get asked if you'd like to log in using Google. So it has the ability to link a lot of different things together. However, that means that your information is in more places. So let's say you use Chrome on your computer and your phone. Your computer might have privacy protocols in place that your phone doesn't. So even if you do a great job protecting yourself on your computer, your phone might be more vulnerable and might be collecting different data. So some things to consider when it comes to browsers. Trackers are tools that follow your journey online. Companies use these to target ads, so and to keep an eye on how many clicks their sites get and to collect data for other reasons as well. Panopticlick is a tool you can use to determine how well your browser protects you against trackers. And privacy is not usually the default. Most automatically store cookies, most track your browsing history and keep your passwords saved. Using private or incognito mode can help mitigate this, but be sure you're aware of what private browsing modes do and do not protect. Make sure you're familiar with your particular browser's privacy settings. Browser extensions can help make your browsing activity more private. Privacy Badger is a great tool that blocks trackers. HTTPS Everywhere ensures that your connection to websites is secure and encrypted. Really, Firefox and Tor browser are your safest bets when it comes to privacy. And that brings me to the Tor project. This project began in 2006, but the idea of an onion router began in the mid-1990s. You can find out more on their website, but here's a brief and general idea of what Tor is. So Tor stands for the onion router, and I got this description from a BBC article, and I really liked how succinctly they put it. It attempts to hide a person's location and identity by sending data across the internet via a very circuitous route involving nodes, which in this context means using volunteers' PCs and servers as connection points. So in the case of the library in New Hampshire that I mentioned earlier, they were using some of their bandwidth to support the process along the way. Encryption applied at each hop along this route makes it very hard to connect a person to any particular activity. So to the website that ultimately receives the request, it appears as if the traffic comes from the last computer in the chain, known as an exit relay, rather than the person requesting the information. So the Tor browser, the Tails operating system, and other encryption tools are all products of this group. And it's all open access and mostly volunteer run, so they're a trusted privacy advocate. These products are highly recommended privacy tools and a great way to explore what it's like to browse anonymously. And now that we know a bit more about browsers and privacy, we want to consider how secure and private our search engines are. DuckDuckGo is a great example of a search engine that prioritizes privacy. So they do not store personal information or search history, which means they don't have any information to sell to advertisers, and they don't track you in or out of private mode. DuckDuckGo is really easy to install and use, which makes it a perfect first step in taking control of your online presence. When it comes to passwords, we again need to think about the sacrifices we make for convenience. We might use the same password for everything because it's easier. We might have a really strong password, but we might keep it written on a sticky note at our desk. So now we'll go over a few tools and techniques you can use to secure your password. But before we move on, I'd like to get some guesses about what the most popular passwords were in 2019. I'll give you a minute. I'll give you a minute to type your guesses in the chat box. 1, 2, 3, 4, password, password, password. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2019, let me in. Password 1, 2, 3, 4. QWERTY, I guessed. Yeah, a birth date. Admin, yeah. Yeah, some of these more personalized ones, sure. Kids and pets names. A phone number. Yeah. So these were the top 20 passwords used in 2019. In other words, do not use these. In this case, popularity is not a good thing. And you can see a lot of these were an elementary school name. Okay. A lot of these were ones that you guessed as well. QWERTY. If you want to test out how strong or how weak your password is, you can go to howsecureismypassword.net, and this tool will tell you how easily your code could be cracked. So these are examples of how this tool works. I used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and password with $ instead of S's for the first two examples at the top. And then I used a passphrase for the third and added another random word to that passphrase for the fourth, a green box. As you can see, It calculates an estimate of how long it would take for a computer to crack your password. So this can be anywhere from instantly to 127 quintillion years. So that can be a fun way to introduce password security to young folks, but it's also really practical and a good way to check your password as well. How Secure is My Password is the name of this resource. So if How Secure is My Password told you it would take little to no time at all to crack your code, it might be a good idea to pick a new password and to change it often, or think about adopting a new password or passphrase. And I've been using the term passphrase and password somewhat interchangeably, but there are differences between the two, which I'll explain now. So phrases or words that have meaning to you can be easier to guess. For instance, your pet's name, your birth date, your favorite song title. And even when you substitute numbers for letters, like 0 for O, and add special characters and capital letters, they can be guessed. So random strings of letters are relatively easy for computer programs to figure out. And passphrases of 6 or more words are very hard for computers to crack. And they're easier to remember than random strings of letters and numbers. In other words, a passphrase is just a secure type of password. We know based on tests of password cracking software that long random passphrases are strongest, and we also know that 1, it's really hard to remember long strings of random characters, and 2, humans are pretty bad at faking randomness. So there's a method called Diceware you can use to create a really strong, good random passphrase rather than a single password that you can probably memorize. And this is how it works. You have sets of 5 dice and a printout or a link to a PDF, if that's an option, of a long numbered word list that's available at www.diceware.com. Roll those 5 dice and write down the numbers that you roll. Repeat that 5 more times for a total of 6 5-digit numbers, and then using that word list, look up the word that corresponds to each number, write it down, and then you have your passphrase. So this results in a very secure password, and it can be a fun activity to boost. Now that you've created passphrases, do you see any potential difficulty to using this method for creating passwords? It can be really hard to remember these new passphrases for every single account. And someone already led me on to the next slide. Security experts recommend using a strong passphrase with a password manager program that will generate unique random passwords for all your different accounts so that you're just not reusing the same passwords again and again. Your passphrase then becomes your master password, and the password manager takes care of remembering everything else. KeePassX is a great one, but there are many out there. They can be handy and very secure, but be cautious and do your research before you use one because you're giving over a lot of access. As well, make sure that you keep track of your master password because that can also become a big issue if you lose your master password to a password manager. Two-factor authentication is becoming a more popular method of securing your online accounts, and there are some really great tools out there if you want to take this approach. Some folks might be familiar with this method if you work in an academic environment or if you use Google products. Essentially, the login process requires a second device in order to ensure that it's you who's logging in. So we've learned about different ways to think about privacy and security, and we've considered the sacrifices we make for convenience. We've also explored some tools and techniques we can use to take control of our online presence. So what do we do with all of this information? We can stay curious about privacy. By showing up today to learn more about online privacy, you took a big first step. Continue to have these conversations and do your research. Organizations like the Library Freedom Project, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Mozilla, Tactical Tech Collective, and more are really great resources. Check the privacy settings on your devices and check the settings on any public computers you might use. When you get new technologies or devices, make sure you consider the privacy settings. And model best practices. Consider the privacy measures you take in your own life and work to become a better advocate through example for others. Engage in dialogue with other folks. I know we talked a lot about larger hypothetical privacy practices today and a lot of foundational information, but I want to leave you with some more practical tools and exercises. Some of these we've gone over. The Data Detox Kit is from the Tactical Tech Collective. That's a great resource for young people. It's a good introduction to privacy issues, and it leads you step by step through detoxing your data footprint, what they call detoxing your data footprint. So it allows you to take some, leave some, approach internet privacy a la carte. My Shadow, we talked about a little bit. That's another from Tactical Tech Collective. That's a deep dive into what our digital footprint looks like and how we can be more conscientious about the ways we exist online. HTTPS Everywhere I mentioned, it gives you more security via secure. It makes sure that you're secure as you browse. The Tor project and Tor browser we talked about. You can find out more information on their website. PrivacyTools.io is a really handy, straightforward guide to being more secure online. It has links to alternative tools and a lot of great articles to back up what they're recommending. Privacy Badger is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and again, this is a browser extension that blocks trackers. The Library Freedom Project, I recommend keeping an eye out for work coming out of the Library Freedom Project. And if you are library staff applying to be part of the next cohort, every year one of the big projects at the end of the institute is to create more resources for the Library Freedom Project to share. So every year the amount of resources gets bigger and bigger, and it's really interesting to look back at some of the projects that have been tackled by that group. How secure is my password? We discussed. Again, that can be a really fun way to think about passwords. Terms of service didn't read. Is anyone familiar with terms of service didn't read? We didn't get into terms of service today, but that is a really interesting site. It will tell you how healthy terms of service are, what you've agreed to when you check the I agree box on various sites and popular platforms. Lost in Small Print is similar, and that is from the folks who came up with My Shadow, me and My Shadow. Threat modeling can be a great way to expand your paradigms concerning privacy. So if you are holding a discussion with folks thinking about online privacy, this can be a great approach. When you practice threat modeling, you consider a certain person, for example, a recent refugee to the U.S. who speaks little English, and then you answer the following questions from their perspective. What do I want to protect? Who do I want to protect it from? How likely is it that I'll need to protect it? How bad are the consequences if I fail to protect it? How much work am I willing to put in to prevent these consequences? And finally, Panopticlick is what we discussed earlier. That can be a great way to assess your browser. So I wanted to ask now, the next time you hear those questions, concerns, or statements about privacy, do you know a way that you would respond to them? Do you have any more questions? Oh, there's a lot of questions coming in here. Any other tools subject the users to selective vulnerability? How risky is it to have your browser remember your password to auto-populate it? I use that a lot as an example of making a sacrifice for convenience, because it can be really convenient to have your browser remember your passwords and automatically log in, but then your browser has all that information, and if somebody else uses your computer, they can log in. Does this apply to mobile devices as well, or just computers? Yeah, mobile devices are in some ways a different animal. There are a lot of privacy concerns on mobile devices, and as I said earlier, there are also when you use a mobile device, particularly I use the example of Google Maps, on your computer, let's say that you're using Mozilla browser and taking precautions on your computer, but you use Google Maps on your phone. Google Maps, unless you turn off that setting, is collecting all those. So if you look at your, that's about the libraries requiring patron ID to use the internet. Thank you, Emma. I think that is the case. Some do, some don't. And that depends on what the library decides to do. And this is another thing to keep in mind if you work in a library. Take a close look at your own privacy policies and how often they're updated, what's been taken into consideration. How do I feel about VPNs? I didn't get into VPNs here, but yeah, they can be very handy, and especially if you are practicing threat modeling, that can be a really essential thing for some folks to use, especially if folks are involved in activism of any kind. VPNs are really interesting to look into, definitely. Your library requires IDs because we don't have filters, so you can contact them. That's really interesting. Do we know what third-party library resources, such as databases, collect? Well, this is another case of looking at, I'm sorry I'm not being able to get to all these questions, but I'm so glad that you have so many. Do we know what third-party library resources, such as databases, collect? So this is a case, again, where libraries should be curious and perhaps critical about not just their own privacy policies, but they should be aware of the privacy policies and terms of service that their vendors employ. And there have been cases in my cohort of the Library Freedom Institute, there were a couple folks who, once they explored their vendors' terms of service and their privacy policies, they went with different vendors or negotiated with those vendors. So that is a conversation that can come up as well. So those concerns can be on a bigger scale as well and can be applied to the entire library and to the vendors you're using. I'm always leery of how secure password protectors are. So that's something to consider too. If a password manager has all of your passwords, LastPass discusses that when you look at their services. That's something to consider and to keep in mind if you want to use a password manager. In today's world, it can be very hard to, it's nearly impossible to say that something can't be hacked or that there won't be a data breach. So that's always something to consider when you're using password managers as well. To sign up for a service to do that, to delete your browser history. If a service does that, that's great. I would recommend deleting your browser history or using a search tracker. Yeah, you can set it to delete as well. And if you're using, depending on the browser you're using and the search engine that you're using, it might not track. So like DuckDuckGo, it won't keep track of stuff unless you ask it to. Our library has a big privacy advocate, so when he negotiates with the vendors, he includes not only what they collect, but what happens to the data. That's great. Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. And that's why these conversations can be really important to not just you and not just your staff, but also to your patrons and your customers who come into the library, because you're setting a precedent there. You're modeling good privacy behavior. If I use that website, will it store the password I'm checking related to, I think this was related to how secure is my password. No, but that is a good concern to have. So if you're typing all of your passwords into that website, is it just collecting all those? I usually test a password that I'm not going to use, but just like if I'm going to use a new passphrase, I test a random passphrase just to see. But I sometimes, that's more of a tool. I use that tool anyway just to test out passwords and use as an example. But how come Google Chrome extensions don't apply to mobile devices? You can set up some extensions on mobile devices, I believe. It's just the functionality, and I am not an expert on how browsers translate to mobile devices either. But either way, I would just make sure that you're aware of what is or isn't being employed on your mobile device. I don't have an exact answer for that, why Google Chrome extensions don't apply to mobile devices, and they might. But again, I'm not sure exactly what the translation is between the functionality of browser Chrome extensions to mobile Chrome extensions. No, please repeat questions. I just didn't have time to get to I couldn't see all these as they were coming. I apologize. So that conversation comes up a lot about the dark web, and if these practices. So could you say more about if these practices, tools, and tips will help? What do you mean by help? But definitely the conversations about the dark web and the dark net come up a lot when you start talking about Tor, because like we talked about, the spectrum of security and privacy, risk and reward are really applicable when it comes to the Tor network, the Tor browser, because being able to be anonymous online can be really, really important to some people, but humans are humans as well. So being anonymous online can also open up doors for folks. The Brave browser, that's a great service. Yeah, the Brave browser is a great browser as well. To minimize the appearance of name, so if these practices, tools, and tips will help minimize the appearance of your name or email on the internet. I published an article. This email is in the article, and this is an international journal. Yeah, well, if your information is out there, I wonder, so if these practices, tools, and tips will help moving forward, that is something to consider when your information is published. So that would be an example of what we talked about earlier, one of those kinds of data that exist out there and can be shared by others. I think being aware that your information is out there is important. That's what I would say. Going to the publisher if you, yeah, yep, that's what I would say. If you'd like it to be removed, going to the publisher, asking them if they can help. Oh, good. And again, so someone said I'm being more cautious now. I think this goes back to my conversation about, or my statement about towing the line between being scaring people, and arming folks with information. This is the line that we walk when we have these conversations, but I think it's really important to emphasize just spreading information to folks, not necessarily scaring people into feeling like everyone already has your information or your personal information, but giving folks information so they can be a little bit more cautious online. Using different emails, Yep, having a personal email and then a different work school email, being really cautious about when those are used, what they're used for. Yeah, these are all great ideas. This is one of my favorite parts about having conversations like this too, because like I said, it is hard to become an expert on online privacy, but we all have experiences and information and resources that can be shared with other folks and might help other folks answer questions that they have like these. And if enough of us have questions and not answers, then that is something that can be talked about as well. How can we find out these answers and what resources can we use? So we have about 5 minutes left. Yeah, a few people have brought up VPNs. Did you have something to add to that conversation, or did you just want to reiterate a question about VPN? That might be something that my colleague can answer. Is there a place to share questions and answers? If there are, so free email services, yes, RiseUp is an email service that offers a little more privacy than Gmail and Outlook. A forum for privacy tools. Is there a place to share your questions and answers? I would keep an eye on the Library Freedom Project. There are some open resources, some openly accessible pages. I'll try and find that too. And I will make sure I remember to put that on my resource list as well. But to keep track of those sorts of forums as a place to share questions or answers as well. Any tips on Google Docs? What do you mean? Just generally, what we think about when we think about privacy in Google Docs? If that's the question, I would say, okay, yes. So Google Docs, I mean, again, this is a great example of how we sacrifice convenience we sacrifice privacy for convenience. So Google Docs, it is all linked to your Google account. There are sharing settings, and you can create somewhat private documents, but that's all attached to your Google account. So Google, generally, any service that's attached to Google is going to be linked to all your other Google stuff. It blocks Google Docs. Yeah, that's a good point. Sync or Dropbox, you know, I'm not sure about the privacy ins and outs of Sync or Dropbox. I'm going to write those down, though, and see. And again, there is, I'm not sure if Sync or Dropbox are owned by other folks, too, but that's something to consider, too. If there are services that are owned by other companies, that can be something to consider, too. Encouraging Google Docs because they don't. Interesting. Yeah, if you want to continue this conversation, I'm going to switch to my last slide here. I'm happy to continue conversations. This is my email. Feel free to email me, and I'll send out an email as well with some resources, and the slides will be available too on the NLM website. We're at 2:59, so I'm going to wrap it up, but thank you so much for participating. Don't forget, this is going to take you to an evaluation page. Please send in your evaluations. We're just continually trying to make these better and better. Thank you so much for attending. Thanks.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel. Select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.